the hour, and it's I'm starting to see some folks pour in. It's so great to have everyone back here again for the Free Learning Conference. Tom, do you want to do some basic introductions before we get going?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So on behalf of Appalachian State University and the Free Learning Conference planning team, I'd like to welcome everybody. Free Learning Conference is now in its 9th year. We went virtual, 3 years ago?
Last year was the first.
Last year was the first, okay. And we're now able to reach even more people. Before we were just kind of meeting on the outskirts. We're in Boone, North Carolina, so just now we're able to have people all the way from California joining us. So, and the conference is all about evaluating effective uses of technology for teaching and learning, but also it's a great opportunity for networking with others. And I'm not gonna be too long here, but I did want to share with you our keynote speaker is Dr. Lindsay Maslin. She's an associate professor of psychology and the coordinator for our early career programs for the Center for Academic Excellence here at Appalachian State. She received her PhD in school and educational psychology with a concentration in methodology and statistics from the University of Georgia in 2011. She serves as consulting editor for the Journal Scholarship of Teaching and Learning in Psychology and is active in Division II of the American Psychological Association Society for the Teaching of Psychology. Lindsay teaches courses in education, psychology, and statistics to future teachers and school psychologists at both the undergraduate and graduate levels. Her research interests lie at the intersection of academic motivation, effective teaching practices, and social justice. Her passion is to help educators make instructional choices that lead to transformative educational experience for the many types of students they find in their classrooms. So without further ado, I want to have Lindsay speak to us for the next 45 minutes about Teach Like Scientists. Use the content and process of the science of learning to transform your teaching. Thank you, Lindsay. I'll stop my share and let you.
All right, can I share?
You can share.
Oh, let's see.
Stop my share. There you go.
All righty. Let's see.
There you go.
Oops, wait a minute. Are you seeing my screen?
I'm seeing your screen.
Great, okay, sorry. We don't want to start at the end, we got to start at the beginning.
You're fine.
All righty. Well, welcome everybody. I'm so excited to get this excellent free learning conference off the ground. I've participated in it for many years, and it's excellent to be able to share some of my thoughts with you this morning as we think about how we might teach like a scientist. Now I want to get started by kind of covering exactly what I won't be doing in today's talk so that your expectations are met. So I'm not going to be telling you how to have more fun in the classroom. There's plenty of places to find that. Sorry if that's what you're hoping for. I'm also not going to tell you really about any tech tools, which might be surprising, but that's because I'm going to leave that to our amazing presenters throughout the rest of the day. Also not going to tell you how to get your students to like you. I don't know about you. I'm preparing for the semester to start on Monday, next Monday for us. And so I always go back and look at my student evaluation data and remind myself of things I could tweak, but I'm not actually going to tell you how to improve that. And I'm not even going to be talking about scholarship of teaching and learning, which when you hear science and you hear higher ed, you might be thinking, oh, this is going to be a SOTL talk. It's not going to be any of that. Instead, what I will try to do is two general things. First of all, I want to give you a way to think about some of the material you're going to get in the other sessions throughout the day, but also maybe how to think more broadly about your process as teaching or as helping other people teach, since I know we have lots of different types of people who attend this conference. So even if you're not particularly familiar with the words on the screen, heuristic, schema, those come from psychology, it's really just ways to think and ways to make decisions about your teaching. And then I always think that a good talk honestly leaves you with more questions than answers. And so that's what I'm going to strive to do. So one of the themes of this conference, but also really anytime we're thinking about teaching in higher ed, is student engagement. And I think we have this idea of student engagement being somewhat like the woman we see on the screen, that when we present to our students, the information we have to share, they have this kind of reaction. I don't know about you guys, but sometimes my students look like this, but a lot of times they don't. But even if I can make them look like this, that's not necessarily the right focus, because it is completely possible to get everybody in a classroom all together and very excited, but they're just being entertained. They're not learning. And so I'm always hesitant when somebody says, oh, we're going to focus on student engagement, because it's completely possible, and particularly with lots of cool ed tech tools, to get everybody really jazzed in the room, but not necessarily learning. So I think it's really important as we think through some of these different options throughout the day, that we make sure that this excitement is actually going to lead to true engagement, which would produce learning. And so kind of my thesis statement for the talk here is how we can use science as a tool to shift the conversation about what it feels like to learn, shift it from one of being about entertainment, which we know how to do well, to one of engagement, so that those kinds of entertained feelings around the thing we want them to learn. Now, the thing about science, we can use science in lots of different ways to help us out. One of the ways that we can use this is to look at what research on learning, the science of learning, tells us is the most effective way to make learning happen. And so when we're doing that, we're looking at the results of science. We are looking at journals on learning, on higher ed. We're reading books that kind of distill down for us how learning is supposed to work. And so we will, for the first kind of half of this talk, think about a little bit about what some of those results are. But then we can also take a little bit more of a bird's eye view. We can step back, we can step up into the mezzanine and look down on the process and think about, what are the decisions that scientists make as they are building an experiment that's going to create knowledge, as they are building a study? What is the process that they utilize? And is there anything that we can take, either as teachers or as people who help teachers, to better refine our process of designing learning? Now, in the pictures that I'm showing on the screen right now, both of these people are wearing white coats or equivalent. And I recognize that most of you who are in the audience right now probably don't wear, white coats are related in your day-to-day work. And so I don't want this kind of analogy of science and scientists to turn you off, because I think of myself as a learning scientist, but this is what I look like when I'm teaching. And that's actually in the building that is currently undergoing a fire drill that I had to run from in order to be able to give this. It sounds like it stopped. But so maybe you feel like you look more like this or some variation of this, and this person as well can, and I would say should, be a scientist. So let's kind of remember that when I'm saying, let's bring science in to our classrooms, I really mean the scientific method. I really mean the process that we go through, whether or not we have test tubes and beakers there while we do it, the process that we go through to make really reasoned decisions about what it is we're doing in the pursuit of learning. But we'll start off though, we'll step back from the process, since that's a little more meta. And we'll start off with the results piece. What does the science of learning have to tell us about the types of learning experiences we should design for our students or with the faculty we work with? So let's look at some of the results. So in order to do this, like a good scientist, we have to get really clear about what we mean by learning, what we mean by the variables and the constructs we use. And so when learning scientists are studying this, they have a very specific definition of learning. Now don't tune out, because this is the only time in the talk that I'm going to put a quotation on the screen. But I think it is important that we all agree, or at least on the same page of what we mean. And so what a scientist who's studying learning, the way that they operationalize or define that variable is this: permanent changes in comprehension, understanding, and skills of the type that support long-term retention and transfer. And what I think is important about this definition is 3 words. First of all, permanent. Recognizing that hopefully whatever is happening is not some temporary thing, that we are actually physically changing the brains of the people who are learning a thing. Also, ideally, this learning is long-term. It is completely possible, and this happens every day, to teach in a way that the students will pass the test. Or to set up assessments that encourage students to study in a way that it will get them through the Monday morning test, but that's as long as it lasts. And I don't know about you all, but I am not in this field, I am not in this career to do that. I'm here for long-term retention. I want them to remember this much beyond the test or the project or the conversation or whatever they need the info for. I talk about this idea of grocery store moments, meaning if I run into one of my former students in the grocery store, 3 years from now, and they come running up and they say, oh, it sounds like we're having some echoes. Does somebody need to turn down their computer who's watching it? Oh, there we go. All right, good. I was just hearing myself echo. So if we, again, grocery store moments. So we run into past student in the aisle of the grocery store, and they come running up, hi, Dr. So-and-so, Mrs. So-and-so, whatever, and they give you a hug. What is the next thing going to be out of their mouth? And you hope it's something related to your field and what you are hoping they would take from you. Are we teaching for that moment? And if we think about it that way, it kind of affects the way you design everything. And then lastly, of course, we're hoping that the stuff that they learn in a higher education classroom can be transferred well beyond the classroom, that they can take that knowledge and apply it to new situations they've never experienced before. Because if all they can do is regurgitate and kind of do again the type of learning that we already did together, then that's not nearly as beneficial as being able to transfer. So this is the way learning scientists define learning. And this right here is one way that we can think about how learning works. Now, we're not going to get too in the weeds of this. And if I have any fellow psychologists watching right now, you will recognize this as the information processing model of memory, which actually is not the most cutting edge model of this. It's getting a little dated. That being said, I think it works excellently as a schema, as a way to kind of build our thinking about the teaching and learning that happens in higher education classrooms. So the way you read this is from left to right. And although I don't want you to think that means that something happens on the left side of the brain and moves to the right. It's not like that. It's just the way we read this diagram. So information enters our brain through sensory memory. And what we know from the research about sensory memory is that it's unlimited in capacity, which is kind of impressive to think about, but it only lasts for like a second or two. And also anything that happens in the sensory memory is happening kind of at the level below consciousness. So you are not aware of the fact that every piece of sensory information in the room you are sitting in right now, it's technically going into your sensory memory. It's kind of good that it's subconscious because we would be really overwhelmed by that. The important thing though, is that we need to move it out of sensory memory. We can't do anything with teaching that just lives there. And the way we do that is by paying attention to information. And once we pay attention to information, that throws it up into our working memory, where we can do something with it. The thing about attention is it's not unlimited. So sensory memory is, attention very limited. So that's why not everything ends up in the memory. And then we do some stuff to the information in working memory and it ends up in long-term memory. And so from a learning scientist perspective, the goal of teaching is to get information into the long-term memory, to get it to stay there. To simplify this, and just to kind of put some pictures with it, basically we're talking about getting information in from the 5 senses. We're throwing it into working memory, which a good analog for that is a chalkboard. That's the mental chalkboard where you're working with the information. So for example, if you're listening to me talk right now, and if for some reason you are moved to take notes, I'm not saying do that, but if you are, the process you use to decide what gets written down on your paper is happening on your mental chalkboard. That's happening in your working memory. Then, if you kind of make some connections between what I'm saying and maybe you've heard somebody give a talk similar to this and you're making a connection there, and then as a result, now you're going to remember that better because you've connected something you already know about to something you're hearing now. That's the process of putting information into your long-term memory, which can be best thought of as a filing cabinet. So that's how I think about teaching, is we're trying to put information into students' filing cabinets. Now, even this is getting a little dated because a lot of us are just using cloud storage these days, but I'm sure a lot of you still have a physical filing cabinet in your office. And some of your filing cabinets are really well organized. Maybe they're color coded, maybe they're alphabetized, and everything is where it's supposed to be. Some of you, though, have that kind of file in the very front, and I have this, I'm guilty of this, the file in the very front of your filing cabinet where you get a piece of paper and you're like, I don't know the best place for this, I'm just gonna put it in that one file. All right, our students are this way too. Some of our students have very well organized long-term memories. So when we give them information, it's easy for them to kind of file that away, and then they can find it really easily in the future. Some of them, though, only right now have that front messy file, and they're just making copies, throwing it in, making copies, throwing it in. And you know it's really hard to find stuff if your filing cabinet's not well organized, if your Google Drive isn't well organized, right? Although I guess with Google Drive we have a search. Unfortunately, we do not have, you know, a search function in our mental filing cabinets. And so ideally what teachers would do, educators would do, would be to structure the learning in a way that makes it easy to organize the mental filing cabinet. That's the idea there. So I want to give you a couple of bits of research that we know that would intentionally respect what I just laid out there, what we know about the flow of information from being in the outside world into our long-term mental filing cabinets, our long-term memory. All right, so one thing that we have studied, and I don't mean me personally, but just people who study this, is how long students can pay attention in the classroom. So I want you to think for a minute, if you have any kind of what's the conventional knowledge about how long students can pay attention, or what's the longest a lecture should be. You've probably heard these kinds of things. So get that number in your head. So I had a number in my head back before I started telling people about this. I thought it was 20 minutes for some reason. I don't know if anybody else thought it was 20 minutes, that I'd heard you should never lecture for more than 20 minutes because after that, the attention wanes. So I thought that was true. And so I went to try to find the research that supports that, and didn't, because there isn't any that supports that. But we have extensively studied attention duration in the classroom, and this is what we found. We have found that attention actually lapses every 5 minutes. It is not 20, it is not 30. And this research, you can see that I'm kind of quoting a review article or citing a review article here. I mean, it's a little old. And so I think that if they were to replicate these studies, it might be even less these days. We also know that those lapses, the frequency of them happening, increases throughout the class period. So towards the beginning, maybe it is 5 minutes between lapses or even more time. But as we get towards the end, it's happening more and more frequently. That's another kind of conventional wisdom I've heard, that you should never expect students to remember anything from the last 10 minutes of class. I couldn't find anything that explicitly supports that either, but this research would give some credence to that idea. But then here's the cool thing, is that we have fewer of these lapses and less frequently when we're doing active learning. Now, you're not surprised about this because the type of people that are going to devote time to come to a virtual conference are like, yeah, we know about active learning. But it's good to understand kind of why, at least from an information processing model of memory standpoint, why active learning is good. Because a lot of times people think of active learning and they're like, that's good because students are interested. They're entertained. And so if you're entertained, you're going to be more likely to learn. And that is not what we're saying here. We're saying that active learning usually is switching things up. And as a result, it's making these nice little packages in the course of our 50-minute period or 75-minute period, whatever. And that the brain is kind of set up to shift in that way. So as we're moving towards the semester and thinking about how we're planning out our time periods, or even if you're doing things like faculty development and thinking about how you're going to plan out your hour workshop or whatever, be real humble about the fact that brains don't pay attention for nearly as long as we think. Okay, so that's the attention piece that we just talked about there. I want to talk about next kind of the capacity of the long-term memory and how long information sticks there, because I think we really oversell that as well. So we really need to respect how much students truly remember out of what we teach. So there's been multiple studies that cover this to see how much do students remember after a semester's over. Now this research I'm going to show you here, I'm going to uncover the bars in a minute. This is from an introductory psychology class. Now, even if you don't teach psychology, there are intro classes in every domain. And so it probably parallels somewhat. Okay, so what they did is at the end of the course, they gave a cumulative final in this introductory psychology class. Go ahead and make a guess as to what you think the average percent would be. This is, by the way, across lots of different courses, lots of different instructors all piled together. All right, so the average score on the final, percent correct, was 80. Okay, so 2 years later, they bring back the same exact individuals who took the final, and they give them the same exact final. So make a guess at what you think their score is going to be now. Now, on one hand, it's like, well, if they truly learned it, if the information is in there for the long haul, then it should be 80% again. It's the same people, it's the same test. Or maybe it should even be higher because they're getting the same test, so they're having like a practice effect. But no, that's not what happens. 56% correct. All right, so we're going from an 80 to a 56. That should give you pause, right? Now, some people might critique and say, well, yeah, sure, but this is an intro class, and so that's a gen ed class that some students might not be that invested in. They're not going to major in it. They're just taking it to check off a box. And so maybe we're kind of diluting the variance because you've got a mix of people in that 56% and in that 80% who don't necessarily care about the content, so maybe they really were learning it for the short term. So in order to look at that hypothesis, well, let's just find the people who actually majored in psychology. Presumably, they would do a good bit better because they're maybe more motivated to remember this stuff. And then also, they've taken a bunch of higher level courses that are just reinforcing the material they originally learned. So you would think that they would do a good bit higher. Not really. It's 63%. Now, I don't say this to be depressing and to make you think, wow, no, gosh, nobody remembers anything, but to introduce a little bit of humility into what the brain seems capable of learning. One thing I hear in my faculty development efforts when I'm kind of helping faculty think through how they might design their courses is this feeling that you have to cover so much, right? Oh, there's so many chapters, there's so many topics. My colleagues who have these students after me have expectations that I have covered certain pieces of information. And I'm willing to bet that in this intro psych class that we're looking at the data for, a lot was covered, but not a lot was retained. And if you think about teaching as coverage, basically what you're doing is you're like blasting content on the student like a fire hose. And if you blast somebody with some water, a very small percent of the total water droplets that came out of the fire hose actually stick on the individual. It's the same thing with learning. And so I would encourage us to shift away from trying to think about how much we can cover to really how much we can cut. Because the brain is set up to really soak in like holistic, general, deeply understood ideas, and very few of them. And so every semester when I teach, even though I'm teaching some classes like this semester, I'll be teaching a class for the 34th time, same exact course. But every semester I try to cut one new thing out. Not because I'm being lazy, but because I understand that the brain can't retain it. So what might we cut just to be respecting what the research says? Okay, so that is about the capacity of the rightmost box of long-term memory. But we can also talk about some of those specific strategies that students and ideally instructors would use to make the process of putting into the long-term memory more effective or trying to make that retention really long-term, to make it be better than 56% 2 years later. What might we do? Now, I'm hesitant to speak about best practices because honestly, I think the science of learning is such that we don't have those figured out yet, and I'm not sure we ever will because of the complexity of things. That being said, if I were pressed, if somebody was like, what do you think is the most effective teaching and learning strategy? If somebody made me say, I would say retrieval. Okay, so retrieval, let me kind of bring this back up real quickly here. Retrieval is simply the process of pulling information out of your long-term memory and then using it. So moving it from the filing cabinet back out to the chalkboard to work with it. This is exactly what we ask students to do on a test. This is exactly what they do on a project, on a paper, anytime where they're using the information that they have internalized, they're doing something with it. That's retrieval. What the research suggests, though, is that waiting until the test or some assessment to have them retrieve the information is too late. And so as instructors, we should not focus so much on having them get information out of their heads so we can judge their learning, but have the pulling out of the heads the actual teaching strategy. And the reason we know that this works is because this kind of study has been done over and over and over again. That's why I would say that it's approaching best practice, not necessarily because it really is just amazing, but because it's been so thoroughly studied that we understand that it works and how. So people have done studies like this. They'll have 2 sections of a course that they're teaching. They're the same instructor for both. Same course, same materials. Everything's going to be the same as much as possible. Except in one of the courses, somebody is going to implement frequent retrieval practice. And most of the studies I'm thinking of, it means low stakes or no stakes quizzes. And every single time, pretty much, the instructor or the section that has lots of those low stakes quizzes produces students at the end of the semester that make a full letter grade higher than the people who didn't have the retrieval practice. And this works even if there's no points attached, because you might be thinking, oh, well, that's just motivating them to do the work and stuff. Even if there's no points attached, even if it's like pop quizzes but without scores happening in the context of class, doesn't matter how you do it, the people who are asked to keep pulling the information out as the learning strategy itself actually learn things more deeply. So just to give a couple quick examples of how you could do this, and you would see there's nothing earth-shattering or that amazingly technological in here, right? Using flashcards, whether or not you're having students make those actually in class, or you are presenting some maybe digital or virtual version of a flashcard as the teaching strategy, not just as a studying strategy, but as the teaching strategy. That works. We know think, pair, share. People have been talking about this forever. Right? But I think that people might say, oh, we should use think, pair, share because that's going to be more active and it's more engaging and you're going to sit there and you're going to reflect and understand somebody else's perspective. Sure, it does all of that. But from a retrieval, from a learning science perspective, it also works because you're just making people get the info back out again. And the more times we get it back out, the better it is staying in there, you know, ironically. Just a brain dump, having somebody to start a class or end of class, write everything that they know about a topic. All you're doing there is pulling it back out, even if you do nothing else with it other than just pull it out. And then, of course, you know, polling software, back up here, you know, popular polling software, Poll Everywhere, Kahoot are just 2 examples. You can do this in most LMS platforms. You can do this in Google Forms, where you're just creating these kinds of low to no stakes quizzes. But here's the thing. A lot of people have heard of this. A lot of you have probably used polling, live polling in your classes. But I think when people use it, they're using it as an engagement tool or like an entertainment tool, really. And some of these platforms have things that are very entertaining, right? They play fun music. You can set up team competitions. You can make it timed, so it feels like a real game. But from a learning science perspective, that actually would not be helpful. Right? It might be more fun, but actually you're giving them a bunch of extra stimulation into their sensory memory that they cannot focus their limited attention on. When the whole reason that polling should be effective is because it's just retrieval practice. They're just practicing getting it out again. So as you think about using some of these popular things in your classes, I would encourage you to ask yourself, do I need the bells and whistles, or do I just need to give them a way to practice getting it out? Do I even need the software at all? I don't know. You have to think through it from this retrieval practice, because otherwise you can get wooed, right? You can get wooed by the bells and whistles and create the top section, create the entertaining classroom that is not actually a classroom of engaged learning. All right, one other little idea from the research before we kind of shift lenses to think about the process. So the other thing that we've learned through the science of learning about retrieval practice is it matters kind of when you ask the students to pull the information out. And so the way you kind of space things out really matters in terms of long-term retention. So the way a lot of people teach classes is what I've got on the screen here right now. So let's say that you've got 6 topics, 6 chapters that you want to cover. Of course, you probably have way more than 6, but let's just pretend that it's 6. What a lot of people do is they'll teach all of chapter 1, and they'll do a lot of amazing active learning in the context of it. Maybe they're doing great polling and great retrieval practice and lots of think, pair, shares and all that. They do all that, and then they have some kind of summative assessment to tie up what we've done in topic 1, and then we move on to topic 2. And then we kind of keep doing that process until we get to the end of the semester, and maybe we have one big cumulative project or cumulative test or something like that that pulls all the topics together. The research shows, though, that that's not the most effective way to use retrieval practice or just teaching in general, because people benefit if we have the retrieval practice spaced out over a long period of time. So an alternative way to set this up might be like this, where you're still teaching the same exact information and you're giving the same amount of coverage to each of the topics, each of the different colors, right? But you are intentionally spacing it throughout the semester so you keep coming back to topic 1 to the yellow. It's not that we get all the way through topic 1 and then we're done. And the reason we know this matters is because of research like this. They'll bring in 2 groups of students, either in a lab or in a real classroom situation. It works both ways, but it's easier to talk about in a lab. Bring in 2 groups of students who are asked to learn some material. Both groups of students are going to be given 30 total minutes for the studying. But group A is going to be asked to do the 30 minutes all at once, like the day before they're going to be tested on it. So that's kind of like the real world version, or the lab version of cramming, right? We call it massed practice and when we study this, but they're going to do all of their studying all together, 30 minutes all together. The other group is also going to do 30 minutes, but they're going to come in maybe on Monday and do 10 minutes, Tuesday 10 minutes, Wednesday 10 minutes, and then the test is on Thursday. So everybody has the same total amount of minutes, but time and again, the people who are forced to space out their practice remember it much better. They do much better on the test. And so we can set up our classrooms in this way. I don't think that this is just about telling the students they should be studying this way, because we say this all the time, you shouldn't cram, you should be studying weeks out, you do it every day. Yes, that's what we tell them. But what if we set up our classrooms to explicitly encourage that? What if we did what we're calling interleaving, where we're mixing in all of the topics and that mixing is spaced out over time? So they're having to constantly retrieve the information throughout the whole semester. So for example, like in a psychology class, I've put these words in there and the topics. Those might be the titles of some chapters in an intro psychology course. And I could teach them the way most people do, and once I'm done with social psych, then we're going to move on to the perception chapter. Or I could set it up that in a way that is interleaved, or weaved, spaced out, and try to come up with some cross-cutting themes that would make those 6 topics make sense altogether. So for example, maybe I'm going to teach a unit not on social psychology, but on how to sell a product, which already sounds more engaging than here's your unit on social psychology. And I could pull something from all those topics 1 through 6 on that, about how if we activate certain emotions, then people are more receptive to doing things, to making purchases. There's a whole subset of cognition called decision-making, judgment decision-making psychology. We could teach them that. We could talk about the effects of culture, right? And then we could do the same thing with other cross-cutting themes, like how to raise a perfect child. That would make some people sit up. Of course, that's not really possible, but that is a very kind of exciting topic that still, it's the same amount of coverage as the first one. So I want to encourage you, if you're a teacher, if you're in a position of helping teachers plan their instruction, maybe getting them to think more broadly, more holistically about how they might set up a semester into these cross-cutting themes that explicitly require, that's the thing, they're like making the students engage in retrieval practice, even if they're bad studiers. The simple fact that we are bringing the topics up again make it more likely that they will remember. Okay, so that is kind of the perspective, just like barely scratching the surface on what some of the research is saying about learning science. And you may have heard of this stuff before, but the reason I want to bring it up is because there's clear research in faculty development that the people who understand the mechanisms behind why a teaching strategy should work actually have better learning happening in their classroom than the people who just learn the strategies, just learn the cool new approaches. If you actually understand why it works, then you're more likely to make very intentional choices. When you modify somebody else's strategy, you're more likely to keep the active components. All right, I think we'll actually skip active learning because I have a feeling with this audience, you guys know about it, but just in general, the point is, we probably have seen Bloom's taxonomy before. Another thing that fits in with the research is that the more we drive people towards the top of this, the more likely they are to remember the information long term. Okay, so that was kind of covering the results of science, some of the outcomes that we can learn from. But now I want us to take that step back, that bird's eye view of thinking about how scientists conduct their work, how they design their studies, their experiments, and if there's anything that we can take from that as we're trying to make learning happen in classrooms day in and day out. And to do this, I I want us to kind of go with a little bit of an analogy or kind of a hypothetical, let's say, a hypothetical situation. I recognize that not everybody who's listening has research as a part of your career. Some of you might have teaching focused positions. Some of you might be doing learning technology, design, and things like that, and might not have research as a very explicit part of what you're doing. That being said, I think we all have a schema for what it means to design research, either just because you read research studies or you had to do a thesis or a dissertation yourself or something like that. So let's put ourselves in the shoes of having to create a research study. And so let's pretend that neither of these people are me, but we'll pretend like this is me, and I've got a student, let's say a graduate student, who has to do a thesis. And so I'm going to be this person's chair, and I'm going to help them design their study. So let's say the student comes to me and she's really excited and she says, Dr. Maslin, I'm so pumped about this thesis, which of course I'm going to be excited because that sounds like my job's going to be easier. And so I say, okay, what do you want to do? What do you want to do? And what I'm assuming that she means by this is that she's been deep in the literature and she's studied some cool theories and she's got the next question that science needs to answer, something like that. That's what I'm going to think. But what if that is not actually what happens? She says, okay, here's my idea. What we're going to do is we're going to show everybody this video. Okay, and we're gonna have people watch the video and we're gonna ask them about their feelings when they watch it. Okay, let's pause that because that's distracting. But let's say that that's what the student comes to you with. And I don't know if you've ever had this experience. I haven't had this exact experience, but I've had something like this where a student wants to do some research and they haven't done any of the legwork. They don't actually understand any of the background. They just saw something flashy and they wanted to study the flashy thing. And so hopefully what the chair would do would be like, oh, that's really interesting, and then kind of guide them towards some relevant literature about emotion activation in media or something. I don't know, this is way out of my area, right? We would gradually steer them that way. And we kind of know that we don't start from the point of the materials when we are doing a research study. So then why do we start with the materials when we are designing our classes? Right? I know so many people who start with a textbook, right? They open up the textbook and then they say, okay, there are 16 chapters in this textbook and there are 16 weeks in my semester. So that is one, chapter a week, and we're gonna have a test at the end of each one. But in some ways that's almost as absurd as, starting with this cute little doggy as the beginning of research. We should probably be starting with something else, and I would advocate that the thing we need to be starting with are the actual variables, like scientists do, and getting really clear for ourselves what we mean by learning in our class. And my definition of learning is going to be different than your definition of learning, or the faculty members with whom you work's definition of learning. All of it's fine, but have you actually operationalized that? And then once you know what the learning piece means, okay, what is the teaching going to look like? What is the intervention? I mean, what is the teaching other than an intervention study to see whether or not my teaching, the intervention, has the desired outcomes? And then, of course, we have to think about all the moderating variables and the things that could make the teaching relationship with the learning go different directions. It could maximize it, it could decrease it. And of course, we do all of this in the context of good course design. Right, so we got to be starting with the variables. That's what scientists do. All right, let's take another piece from this analogy. So let's say I get this student to a point of coming up with a good study. We've moved away from the little massaging doggy, and we've got a good idea. Then the next thing we have to do is we have to send it to the institutional review board, right? We have this group of people who are going to scrutinize every aspect of this honors thesis student's thesis. That's not going to hurt anybody, but we still have to have it so carefully scrutinized. And every survey, we're going to ask every participant to fill out, even if it's completely innocuous. We have to get it approved by this body. And the people who create science, who do research, are it's a little onerous to do this, but we're all on board with it. And we recognize it's necessary to maintain the ethical integrity of the science that's being done. We'll make sure our teaching is ethical. Now, I am not advocating that we need a teaching IRB, because that would be problematic in so many ways, but I'm just trying to bring up the idea of, isn't it interesting that we have this one kind of bastion of higher ed, research, science, that we subject to all this scrutiny, and we recognize that we need to do that for the good of the science. But then over here with teaching, people can just go in there and start teaching. I mean, we have graduate students all the time go in with no formal pedagogical training, and it's fine. Whereas if we're just going to send in a personality questionnaire to ask, you know, some 20-year-olds to fill out, that has to be intensely scrutinized. And in fact, with this IRB stuff, right, you have to get trained. Anybody who's going to be a researcher has to be trained to understand that any research you're doing needs to respect the participants and allow them autonomy, allow them decision-making. It has to do more good than harm, and it has to be fair to everybody who's participating. Wouldn't it be nice if we had to make sure that all of our teaching did that? I'm sure all of you do that, because again, we have a very restricted range of audience. But wouldn't it be interesting if academia of higher ed required that, demanded that we could prove, maybe in our promotion and tenure materials, I don't know, that our teaching respects these three principles at the same level that our research does. All right, last kind of analogy here before we start tying things together. All right, so let's say we've gotten to the point, the student got the study through IRB, they ran the study, we got some good results. So we're gonna write them up and we're gonna send them to a journal to be published. And I'm sure any of you who have done this exact thing before have had this experience with reviewer 2, right? Where you get this feedback that's just like, ugh, right? So what if the feedback that you get is something like this? Now, unless you have a statistics background, this is gonna look like a bunch of mumbo jumbo, and that's fine. But the point is, sometimes you get this very technical feedback, very detailed feedback from a reviewer in the context of doing research, and you read it and you're like, darn it, they're right. Sometimes they're wrong, sometimes they're just off their rocker, you know, but sometimes they are totally right, and you read it and you go, oh, yeah, I missed that. And it's heartbreaking, but we submit ourselves to this level of critique because we know it's good for the field. And we know that it's the only way to move things forward is to have this kind of peer review. So then I wonder, if we're totally on board with that, then why do we do a really poor job with our peer critique of teaching? And I don't mean that the people who are in the teachers or the centers of teaching and learning. I'm hoping all you guys do it well. But what I mean is the peer review that we use for promotion and tenure, at least like here in my department, we review each other. And this is a little screenshot of our form, the top of our form. And nobody has ever, on any of those forms, written a single negative or I would say even constructive thing on that form. Because we're so hesitant to give true peer critiques that have the level of truth as that reviewer 2. For some reason, we feel like that teaching needs to be treated with kid gloves, which I think is kind of weird, because think about how many hundreds of people we interact with every day. I interact with way more students than participants, even though I'm doing both research and teaching over the course of a semester. You know, and this isn't just an issue in my department or at my university, right? This is from the Chronicle over the summer, kind of a scathing review of peer observations. It's just interesting to me that we will submit one part of, you know, academia to intense review and another one, for some reason, we won't. Okay, so let's time out, because what I've been saying here, I've been trying to advance the idea of why don't we take some of that kind of deep intensity and intentionality that we bring to science, to research, and then kind of bring it over to teaching. And you might be thinking, well, you know, just you can do that. But just because you can do that doesn't mean you should do that. Well, here's why I think we should bring some of it. And I'm not asking for additional oversight. I'm just talking about thinking about this thematically, metaphorically, right? Here's one reason why I think we might want to teach the way a scientist creates knowledge, maybe for these people. Okay, maybe not these exact people. This might not be them in their best state, but okay. So these are App State students, but whatever university you are at or work with, right? There are these people that show up in these classrooms day in and day out who hopefully are going to do amazing things once they leave us. And maybe not because of us, and maybe in spite of us, but these are the people who show up, and we have, yes, a financial relationship with them because they are paying to receive an education, but more importantly, a moral and ethical relationship to give them something worth learning. And if we know that there's this whole other way of being in the academy that is about intentionality and being careful and scrutinizing our choices, why don't we just take that same skill set and give it to these guys? Or maybe you don't have a soft spot for your students. Maybe they don't give you warm fuzzies, that's fine. But maybe you really believe in the ability of your discipline to contribute something meaningful to the world. Maybe you believe that there's knowledge your discipline holds, or skills, or lenses, ways of being and viewing, that if other people knew about it, the world would be better. And so even if you don't even care about the students, even if you just care about your domain, wouldn't you want to treat your domain with the level of care that we would treat, you know, a chemistry experiment? Why wouldn't we bring that level of critique? And here's the thing I love about science too, because scientists are supposed to be kind of dispassionate, which is a little weird because as teachers, that's the very opposite of what we think of ourselves as. But I think that the dispassion can actually open up, pave the way for a lot more passion, engagement, those kinds of things, because there's three basic scientific values that if we were to infuse these into our teaching, what would that look like? Scientists are very curious. When something happens in the lab, they go, huh. They don't jump to a quick conclusion. So like if we were to take this into our classrooms and a student fails a test, we're quickly like, well, they didn't study or something like that. But what if we were to be more scientific about it, instead of jumping to really almost feels like an a priori thought, like you knew they weren't going to study, students these days, right? Instead of doing that, going, huh, what are other reasons why students might not have done well? It might be me. It might be the assessment. All these other things, right? We would approach things differently. What if we approach things with skepticism? Maybe we try something in our classroom and it works really well the first time we try it, and so then we think, I'm a convert, I'm doing it that way forever and for always. That's not what scientists do. When they find something that works, they say, okay, it worked one time. I need to replicate it. I need to test the boundaries of it to see when it works and when it doesn't work. Can I break it, right? And so the analog to that with our students would be, okay, we found a teaching strategy that sounds like a best practice. What are the limits of that? What are the active components? What are the things in the thing that I'm doing that are really mattering? And are there other things I can cut that aren't really mattering? Are there things that I am doing that are actually disadvantaging to certain types of students in my classroom? So it's a best practice for this type of student, but it is not a best practice for this type of student. How would we change the way we build our learning if we brought scientific skepticism and this requirement of data before we believe that something works? How would our classrooms be different? And then possibly above all, scientists have a lot of humility. Like I said, they're dispassionate. They do not attach personal feelings to their laboratory successes or to their laboratory failures as much as possible. And they don't take credit where credit isn't due. I think a lot of times when students do well in our classes, we think that was us. But there are tons of students who would do well in spite of us. And so we need to be really humble about the fact that there's only so much that we are contributing. So we've got to get laser focused on exactly what it is that we're doing and tweaking in order to make the changes we want to see in our classrooms. So to bring it back around to what we've been talking about, what I've tried to do is bring in kind of two lenses, both of which are united by science. On one side, we've got what the learning scientists are telling us about the way the brain works, the way that memory works, and of course, the way that we should be teaching in order to respect the way the brain works. But then we also have this alternative perspective we can use, also informed by science, that is about scientific process, method, about getting really clear about what my variables are, the things that I'm manipulating, the confounding variables that I need to measure, the student characteristics that matter about in terms of the efficacy of my teaching. So if we can bring these two pieces together, I'm thinking that we can do some pretty good things in higher ed. So that is my call to you as you go throughout the rest of this day and start thinking about all these new ideas you're going to hear about. I want you to be using the litmus test of, is this going to fit into my class? Is this going to affect my variables in the way I want? I'm going to be skeptical, I'm going to be humble and curious. And then also as you move into the coming weeks and you start to teach and you start to really refine your assessments and your lectures, your activities, think about doing it with this curious, humble, and skeptical mind. All right, that's it.
Lindsay, thank you so much. You're awesome. I appreciate it.
Sure.
I'm going to send the chat message to everybody in the chat window for the schedule for the day. And let's give Lindsay a round of applause here, virtually anyway. So it's really good, and it's a lot to think about as we go into the new academic year for all of us. So good stuff. But I sent the chat message link. I'll send it in because they're getting a lot of thanks, Lindsay's in there. I'll keep sending it in a couple times in the chat window. There it is again. But again, thank you for all your time and wisdom here. And I need to come see you teach some because you're awesome. Next session start at 11 o'clock, and I hope you'll have a great rest of your day for the free learning conference.